The camera flashes were blinding, a rhythmic pulse of white light that turned the velvet red carpet into a high-stakes stage. Ethan stood at the center of it all, the sharp lines of his designer tuxedo matching the calculated precision of his expression. He looked every bit the king of the corporate world, untouchable, polished, and perfectly alone. A few yards away, tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain near the service entrance, Sarah held his heavy wool overcoat against her chest. She stayed in the shadows, just as they had practiced for 5 years. To the security guards, she was a personal assistant. To the photographers, she was invisible. To Ethan, she was the secret he kept in a locked room at the end of a long hallway. A reporter leaned in, her microphone topped with a bright network logo. "Mr. Vance, your company just acquired the largest tech firm in the country. You have the world at your feet. But the public wants to know, is there someone special sharing this throne with you? Or is the rumors true that you're the city's most dedicated bachelor?" Sarah felt her heart skip. Today was their 5th wedding anniversary. She had a small gold band tucked into the inner pocket of her dress, a hidden symbol she only wore behind closed doors. She looked at Ethan, hoping for a flicker of hesitation, a brief moment where the man who kissed her forehead that morning would override the CEO who ruled the boardroom. Ethan didn't even blink. He leaned into the microphone, a charming, cold smile spreading across his face. "Success requires total focus," Ethan said, his voice smooth and devoid of any doubt. "Romance is a distraction I simply don't have room for. My work is my only commitment. I have no time for a wife, and frankly, no interest in one. I'm quite happy being exactly where I am, on my own." The crowd chuckled, charmed by his ruthless dedication. The reporter nodded, scribbling down the quote that would be the headline of every digital tabloid by morning. "The Ice King stays frozen." Behind the curtain, the air felt thin. Sarah looked down at the coat in her arms. It still smelled like him. Sandalwood and expensive espresso. But suddenly, the weight of it felt like lead. She wasn't just hidden, she was being erased in real time. She watched him move down the line, shaking hands and laughing with starlets, never once glancing toward the shadow where she stood. She realized then that he wasn't protecting her from the world. He was protecting his image from her. To him, she was a liability to his brand, a piece of his old life that didn't fit the sleek modern aesthetic of a billionaire titan. Sarah slowly folded the coat and placed it on a nearby equipment crate. She took the small gold band from her pocket and set it right on top of the dark fabric. There was no anger, no sudden outburst of tears, only a quiet, hollow realization that she had been holding her breath for half a decade, waiting for a man who was already gone. As the gala doors swung open and the music swelled to greet the man of the hour, Sarah turned her back on the lights. She walked out through the service exit and into the cool night air, the sound of the camera shutters fading behind her. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't wait for him to tell her it was safe to leave. She just started walking. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and silent streets, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the red carpet. When Sarah finally pulled into the driveway of the Vance estate, the massive wrought iron gates groaned open like the mouth of a tomb. The house sat on the hill, a sprawling masterpiece of glass and steel that Ethan had bought 3 years ago to celebrate a record-breaking merger. To the architectural magazines, it was a triumph of modern minimalism. To Sarah, it was a museum where she was the only exhibit not allowed to be seen. She stepped into the foyer, her heels clicking sharply against the polished white marble. The sound echoed up into the vaulted ceilings, mocking the stillness. There were no family photos on the walls, no stray shoes by the door, and no scent of a home-cooked meal. Ethan preferred the clean look, which meant every trace of a human life had to be tucked away in hidden cabinets or relegated to the basement. Even the flowers in the crystal vases were replaced every 2 days by a professional service, ensuring they were always perfectly bloomed and never dropping a single, messy petal. Sarah walked into the kitchen, a space filled with industrial-grade appliances she rarely used because Ethan preferred catered dinners or late-night protein shakes. She looked at the calendar on the smart fridge, a digital screen that synced with Ethan's office. Her name didn't appear once. Instead, it was a sea of blue blocks labeled board meeting, press junket, and dinner with investors. She had spent 5 years trying to fit her entire existence into the white spaces between those blue blocks, only to realize tonight that those spaces were actually empty. She wandered into the master bedroom, a suite larger than the apartment she had lived in when they first met. Back then, they lived in a cramped studio where the heater hummed too loudly and the smell of cheap pizza lingered in the curtains. Ethan had been a struggling analyst then, full of fire and promises. He used to hold her hand under the table at diners, whispering that one day he'd give her the world. He had kept his word about the world, but he had forgotten to stay in it with her. Sarah opened the massive walk-in closet. One half was a disciplined row of charcoal suits and crisp white shirts, smelling of dry cleaning and ambition. Her half was filled with elegant, expensive dresses that she only wore within these four walls or to private events where she was introduced as a family friend or the assistant. She reached out and touched the silk of a navy blue gown she'd worn to a private dinner last month. Ethan had told her she looked beautiful that night, but then he'd spent the entire evening talking over her, treating her like a decorative lamp that occasionally nodded. The silence of the mansion began to feel heavy, pressing against her ears. This house was designed to impress people who would never visit and to house a woman who didn't officially exist. Every expensive rug and every piece of custom furniture felt like a bribe, payment for her silence, a gilded cage built to keep her quiet while Ethan played the part of the world's most eligible bachelor. She sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, the silk sheets cool and unforgiving. She looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Ethan wouldn't be home for hours. He'd be at the after-party, basking in the glow of his own myth. He would come home smelling of expensive scotch and success, expecting her to be waiting up to take his tie and listen to his triumphs. But as she looked around the cold, perfect room, Sarah realized she didn't want the world he had built. She wanted the man who used to share a pizza with her on a sagging sofa. That man was dead, buried under layers of ego and corporate branding. She stood up, her mind suddenly clear. She didn't need to scream or break the expensive vases to be heard. She just needed to stop being the ghost in his machine. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls of the Vance Tower, but it felt cold, like light reflecting off an iceberg. Sarah had come to the office to drop off Ethan's passport for his sudden trip to Tokyo, a task she usually handled through a courier to avoid being seen. But today, something felt different. She didn't want to hide in the shadows anymore. She walked through the lobby, her heart hammering against her ribs, feeling like a trespasser in her own husband's life. When she reached the executive floor, the elevator opened to a world of hushed whispers and clicking keyboards. She made it as far as the glass-walled conference room before she heard voices. Ethan was standing by the window, his back to the door, looking out at the city he conquered every morning. Across from him sat Victoria, a woman whose name appeared in the blue blocks of his calendar more often than Sarah's ever did. Victoria was his lead investor, and the woman the tabloids constantly linked him to, a shark in a red power suit who understood the language of profit and loss. Sarah hesitated at the door, the passport heavy in her hand. She was about to knock when Victoria's sharp, melodic laugh cut through the air. Victoria was looking at a photo on her tablet, then glanced up at Ethan with a smirk. She didn't see Sarah standing in the reflection of the glass. "I saw that girl backstage at the gala last night, Ethan," Victoria said, her voice dripping with casual disdain. "The one holding your coat like a loyal puppy. Honestly, your hiring standards for personal assistants must be slipping. She looked so plain, so out of place. It's embarrassing for a man of your stature to have someone so domestic." hanging around the VIP entrance. Ruins the aesthetic of the brand. Sarah froze. The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. She waited for the correction. She waited for Ethan to turn around with that terrifying, cold stare he used in boardrooms and say, "That's my wife you're talking about." She waited for him to tell Victoria that Sarah was the reason he had a clean suit, a clear head, and a home to return to. Instead, Ethan just poured himself a glass of water, his expression unreadable. "She's just someone who handles the house, Victoria. She's functional. Don't let it bother you. She knows her place is in the background." Victoria chuckled, leaning back in her leather chair. "Well, good. Because a man like you needs a partner who commands a room, not a mouse who hides in the curtains. You need someone who adds value to your life, but not someone who just takes up space in your mansion." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't even flinch at the word mouse. He just nodded slightly, checking his watch as if the conversation about his wife was as mundane as discussing the quarterly earnings. "The branding is under control. Let's focus on the Tokyo merger. That's what actually matters." The passport slipped from Sarah's fingers, hitting the thick carpet with a dull thud. The sound was quiet, but in the silence of the executive suite, it felt like a gunshot. Ethan turned, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second when he saw her standing there. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah didn't look away. She didn't blush or apologize for interrupting. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. She saw a man who had traded his soul for a brand and his heart for an aesthetic. Victoria stared at her with a look of pure, haughty confusion, but Sarah didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Sarah walked into the room, picked up the passport, and placed it slowly on the mahogany table. She didn't say a word to Victoria. She didn't even look at her. She kept her eyes on Ethan, who looked like he wanted to reach out but was too afraid of what his business partner would think. "You forgot this," Sarah said, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm. She turned and walked out, the sound of her heels no longer clicking with hesitation, but with the rhythm of someone who was finally walking toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Victoria ask, "Who was that anyway?" And for the first time, Sarah didn't stay to hear Ethan's lie. The drive back from the office felt like the end of a long, exhausting movie. Sarah didn't cry. The time for tears had passed somewhere between the red carpet and the cold silence of the executive suite. She moved through the mansion with a strange mechanical grace, her mind clearer than it had been in years. There was no frantic packing, no throwing clothes into suitcases, and no shattered glass. She didn't want to leave a mess behind. She wanted to leave a void. She went to the bedroom and pulled out a single modest suitcase she had owned before she ever met Ethan. She packed only the things she had bought with her own money from her part-time job years ago: the worn-out jeans, the faded cotton sweaters, and the books with creased spines. She left behind the designer gowns, the diamond necklaces, and the shoes that cost more than a month's rent. They weren't hers. They were costumes Ethan had bought for a character he never let her play. As she moved through the house, she performed one last act of service. She straightened the pillows on the sofa. She organized the mail on the marble counter. She ensured the kitchen was spotless, the surfaces gleaming under the recessed lighting. She wanted the house to look exactly the way Ethan liked it: perfect, sterile, and empty. She wanted him to walk in and see that everything was in its place, except for the one thing he had spent 5 years taking for granted. In the master bedroom, she stood before the nightstand. She looked at the small gold wedding band on her finger. It felt heavy, like a shackle she had finally found the key to. She slid it off. Her finger felt strangely light, and the skin underneath a little paler than the rest. She placed the ring in the center of the dark wood nightstand, right where he would see it when he reached for his phone in the morning. Next to the ring, she laid out the divorce papers. She had kept them in a hidden folder for months, a just-in-case, that she had hoped she would never need. She had already signed them, There was no long, rambling letter explaining her pain. There were no accusations or pleas for him to change. Ethan was a man who dealt in facts and bottom lines, and the fact was that she was done. She took one last look around the golden cage. The sunset was casting long orange shadows across the floor, making the glass walls look like they were on fire. It was a beautiful house, but it was never a home. It was just a monument to one man's ego. Sarah picked up her suitcase and walked to the front door. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate at the threshold. She stepped out and pulled the heavy door shut, hearing the electronic lock click into place with a definitive metallic snap. She walked down the driveway, the evening air smelling of rain and freedom. By the time Ethan's flight landed in Tokyo, she would be miles away. By the time he realized she wasn't coming back, she would be a stranger again. He had spent years telling the world she didn't exist, and now she was finally going to make that his reality. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove toward the gates. As they swung open to let her out, Sarah felt the weight of the last 5 years drop away in the rearview mirror. Ethan returned from Tokyo with the adrenaline of a closed deal still buzzing in his veins. When he stepped into the mansion, the silence greeted him like a professional concierge. It was exactly how he liked it. No one was there to ask how his flight was. No one was waiting with a tea he didn't want, and no one was hovering in the hallway with a look of quiet expectation in their eyes. For the first few days, the freedom felt like a luxury. He left his shoes in the middle of the foyer and they stayed there. He worked until 3 in the morning in the living room, leaving his laptop and coffee mugs scattered across the designer glass tables. In the past, Sarah would have moved them, or worse, she would have sat in the corner with a book, her mere presence making him feel a vague, flickering sense of guilt for ignoring her. Now, there was nothing but the hum of the climate control system. He went to the club with Victoria and a group of investors on Tuesday night. He stayed out late, laughing at jokes about the ball and chain of traditional marriage. He felt lean and fast, like a race car that had finally shed unnecessary weight. He told himself that the divorce papers on the nightstand were just a formal acknowledgement of a reality he had already created. He didn't even pick up the gold ring. He just moved it to the back of the drawer to make room for his watch collection. By Wednesday, he enjoyed the fact that he didn't have to check in. He didn't have to send a "running late" text. He ordered expensive takeout and ate it straight from the containers while standing at the kitchen island, staring at his reflection in the dark windows. The house was a masterpiece of order. Without Sarah's small touches, the occasional vase of wildflowers she'd picked, the soft throw blankets she used to drape over the armchairs, the rooms looked like a high-end furniture catalog. It was crisp. It was professional. It was the perfect environment for a man of his stature. On Thursday, he realized he hadn't heard a single question in 4 days. No one asked him if he had eaten. No one asked him if he was sleeping enough. No one asked him what he was thinking. It was a relief to be done with the emotional clutter of a partner. He felt like he was finally living the life of the bachelor king the media had always portrayed him to be. He spent his evenings looking at stock tickers and scrolling through news feeds, basking in the absolute stillness of his kingdom. The lack of noise was a sign of his total control. He was the master of this space, and there was no one left to complain about the coldness of the air conditioning or the late hours he kept. He told himself he was more productive than ever. He convinced himself that the hollow feeling in his chest when he turned off the lights at night was just the physical exhaustion of being at the top of his game. By the end of the week, the house was perfectly clean, perfectly quiet, and perfectly still. Everything was exactly where he wanted it to be. He had all the space in the world, and for the first time in 5 years, there was no one around to tell him he was wrong. He poured a glass of scotch, sat in his leather chair, and toasted to his new life. The silence was his greatest achievement, and he intended to enjoy every second of it. The second week began with a series of small, irritating frictions that Ethan couldn't quite explain. It started with his morning routine. He reached into the pantry for the specific blend of vitamins he took every day, only to find the bottle empty. In the past, he never had to think about it. The bottle was simply always full, replaced as if by magic. That afternoon, he developed a pounding headache and went to the medicine cabinet, but he couldn't find the brand of aspirin that didn't upset his stomach. He searched through drawers of organized linen and sterile first aid kits, realizing he had no idea where Sarah kept the things that actually kept him functioning. At the office, the friction turned into a grind. His executive assistant, a highly paid professional, came into his office looking frazzled. A major client from a traditional family-owned firm had pulled out of a weekend golf retreat, citing a lack of personal touch. Ethan was confused. He had sent the standard corporate gift basket and a formal invitation. Mr. Vance, his assistant hesitated. In the past, these clients always received a handwritten note or a small, thoughtful gift that felt less corporate. I assumed you were handling that yourself. Ethan sat back, his brow furrowing. He remembered Sarah sitting at the kitchen island late at night, pensively writing on heavy cream stationery. He had always rolled his eyes at it, calling it a waste of time. Now he realized those notes weren't just domestic clutter. They were the social glue that had smoothed over his cold, analytical edges. Sarah had been the bridge between his ruthless ambition and the human beings he needed to do business with. Without her, he was just a man with a spreadsheet, and his clients were starting to feel the chill. The cracks widened when he tried to prepare for a high-stakes meeting with an international delegation. He looked for a specific file, a collection of personal notes on the delegates' cultural preferences and family histories. He knew he had seen it on his desk at home months ago. He spent 2 hours tearing through his home office, only to find a digital folder on his private server labeled Essential Context. Sarah had curated it. She had spent her invisible hours researching the people he dealt with, giving him the insights that made him look like a genius in the boardroom. By Friday, the physical toll of his freedom became undeniable. He had been eating takeout for 7 days straight, and his energy levels were crashing. He opened the refrigerator, hoping to find one of the healthy, prepped meals Sarah used to leave in glass containers with instructions on how to heat them. There was nothing but a half-empty bottle of sparkling water and a wilted lemon. He sat at the massive kitchen island, the silence of the mansion no longer feeling like a luxury. It felt heavy, like a pressure in his ears. He realized that Sarah hadn't just been handling the house. She had been managing his entire life so that he could focus on being the Ice King. She was the navigator of a ship he thought he was sailing alone. He picked up his phone to call her, his thumb hovering over her name before he remembered the ring in the drawer and the signed papers. He looked around the pristine white kitchen and felt a sudden sharp pang of something he hadn't felt in years: incompetence. He was a billionaire who could move markets with a single tweet, but he didn't know how to order his own vitamins or keep a client happy without a script. The aesthetic of his life was perfect, but the machinery underneath was starting to smoke and rattle. For the first time, Ethan looked at the empty hallway and wondered if he had mistaken his wife's support for his own talent. The silence in the house had shifted from peaceful to haunting, driving Ethan to wander into parts of the mansion he usually ignored. He found himself in the small sunroom tucked away at the back of the second floor, a space Sarah had claimed as her own, but he had never bothered to visit. It was the only room in the house that didn't feel like a showroom. A stack of leather-bound sketchbooks sat on a small wooden table, looking dusty and neglected. Ethan opened the first book, expecting to see idle doodles or floral patterns. Instead, he found himself staring at a raw visual history of their life together. The early pages were filled with light, energetic sketches of the two of them in their old studio apartment. There were drawings of Ethan sleeping at his desk, his face softened by rest, and notes in the margins about his favorite meals and the dreams he used to talk about. As he flipped through the pages, the style changed. The lines became sharper, more isolated. there were sketches of Sarah sitting alone at the massive dining table. Her figure small and surrounded by vast, empty, white space. In the later books, he saw drawings of himself from the back, always walking away, always toward a door or a camera lens. Tucked into the back of the final sketchbook was a thick white envelope from a local hospital. Ethan pulled out a sheaf of papers, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. It was a series of medical reports dated over the last 2 years. Sarah had been diagnosed with a chronic neurological condition that caused episodes of intense pain and fatigue. He scanned the dates, realizing that several of her bad days coincided with major milestones in his career. He remembered a night a year ago when he had snapped at her for being too tired to attend a charity gala. She had apologized quietly, her face pale, and spent the night alone while he told the press she was under the weather. He realized now she hadn't just been tired. She had been in agony. There were notes from her doctor about the need for a support system and reduced stress. Sarah had never mentioned it. She had filled her own prescriptions, attended her appointments in secret, and spent her recovery days making sure his suits were pressed and his meetings were scheduled. The weight of the papers felt like a physical blow. He sat on the floor of the sunroom, surrounded by the evidence of a woman who had spent years protecting him from the reality of her own suffering. She had hidden her illness because she knew he had no time for romance or the messy, inconvenient parts of being a human being. She had played the part of the perfect, invisible wife even while her own body was failing her, all so he could maintain his image of the untouchable titan. Ethan looked at a sketch on the very last page. It was a drawing of a bird in a golden cage, but the door was wide open. The bird wasn't flying away. It was just sitting there, looking at the horizon with a sense of profound exhaustion. Underneath, Sarah had written a single line: "I stayed until I had nothing left to give." The guilt hit him then, a cold, suffocating wave that made his hands shake. He had built an empire on the back of a woman he had refused to even acknowledge. He had called her a distraction, while she was the only thing keeping him whole. He realized that his success wasn't just built on his ambition, it was bought with her silence and her health. He looked around the empty, beautiful room, and for the first time, the Ice King felt the first cracks of a total, devastating thaw. The realization of Sarah's secret pain acted like a spark in a room full of gasoline. Ethan didn't go to the office the next morning. Instead, he sat in his high-tech command center at home, surrounded by monitors that usually tracked global markets, and began a different kind of hunt. He called the head of his private security detail and gave him Sarah's name, her license plate, and her social security number. He demanded every bank statement, every toll booth photo, and every credit card ping. He was used to getting what he wanted with a few phone calls, but as the hours ticked by, the reports came back empty. Sarah hadn't used their joint accounts. She hadn't stayed at any of the luxury hotels they frequented. She had vanished into the ordinary world, a place where his name carried no weight. In the middle of his frantic search, his phone buzzed. It was Victoria. She was calling to discuss the final signatures for the Tokyo deal, her voice as sharp and demanding as ever. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. He didn't even say hello. He just listened to her complain about a minor delay in the paperwork and how that girl from the office had probably misplaced something before she left. "Her name is Sarah," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "And she is my wife." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Victoria let out a short, nervous laugh. "Ethan, don't be dramatic. We have a brand to protect. If you're having some kind of midlife crisis over a house manager, keep it private. Though we have a meeting in 20 minutes. "There is no meeting," Ethan replied. He felt a strange sense of clarity, a cold anger that was finally pointed in the right direction. "And there is no partnership. I'm pulling the Vance Group out of every deal associated with your firm. I don't care about the penalties. I don't care about the aesthetic. You're fired, Victoria. "Don't set foot in my building again." He hung up before she could scream, blocking her number with a flick of his thumb. He felt a brief flash of satisfaction, but it was quickly swallowed by the hollow ache in his chest. Firing Victoria was easy. Finding the woman he had spent 5 years erasing was proving to be impossible. He realized then that he didn't even know her best friend's last name. He didn't know the name of the cafe she liked or the park where she went to clear her head. He had all the data in the world, but he had none of the memories that actually mattered. He spent the rest of the night driving through the city, looking for her car in random parking lots, his heart jumping every time he saw a woman with dark hair crossing the street. He went to the small bakery where they used to buy bread when they were poor, but the shop had been replaced by a modern pharmacy years ago. He was a man who could track a shipment across the ocean in real time, yet he was lost in his own city. Every resource he had was designed to control and dominate, but none of it could help him find a person who didn't want to be found. He sat in his car on a quiet side street, his head resting against the steering wheel. He had spent his life building walls to keep people out, and now he was trapped behind them. The desperate search wasn't just about finding Sarah. It was the beginning of a terrifying realization that the world he had built was a prison, and he was the only one left inside. The private investigator's final report sat on the passenger seat of Ethan's car, pointing him toward a coastal town 3 hours away from the city. It was a place of salt air and weathered wood, far removed from the glass towers and silent marble halls of his everyday life. Ethan drove through the narrow streets, his expensive car looking like a foreign object against the backdrop of local bookstores and family-owned diners. He felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach that no billion-dollar merger had ever caused. He found her at a small community art gallery near the pier. He parked across the street and watched through the large front window, his breath catching in his throat. Sarah was there, but she wasn't the woman he remembered. The pale, tired shadow who used to wait for him in the foyer was gone. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress, her hair loose and catching the afternoon light. She was moving through a small group of people, holding a palette and pointing toward a canvas on the wall. Then he heard it. A sound that made him freeze. Sarah laughed. It wasn't the polite, muted chuckle she used at corporate dinners. It was a bright, genuine sound that reached her eyes. She was smiling at a man who was helping her adjust a spotlight, a look of pure, unburdened joy on her face. In that moment, Ethan realized with a crushing weight that he had never seen her look that beautiful, because he had never given her a reason to be happy. He had provided her with a mansion and a credit card, but he had starved her of the light she was currently radiating. He stepped out of the car, his suit feeling stiff and suffocating in the sea breeze. As he pushed open the gallery door, a bell chimed and the small crowd turned. Sarah's smile didn't just fade, it vanished instantly. The warmth left her face, replaced by a mask of calm, distant recognition. The silence that followed wasn't the sterile quiet of the mansion. It was the heavy, charged silence of a storm about to break. "Ethan," she said quietly. She didn't move toward him. She didn't look afraid or even angry. She looked at him with the same polite indifference he had shown her for 5 years. "Sarah, please," Ethan started, his voice cracking. He looked around at the humble gallery, at the sketches on the walls that looked so much like the ones in her secret book. "I found the medical reports. I found the sketchbooks. I fired Victoria. I've changed everything. I want you to come home." Sarah looked at him for a long time, then glanced back at the people in the gallery who were watching them with curiosity. She stepped closer to him, but only to keep their conversation private. "Home?" she asked softly. "Ethan, that house was your monument, not our home. I spent years trying to make myself small enough to fit into the corners of your life. I almost disappeared entirely." "I can give you anything now," Ethan pleaded, each reaching out to take her hand, but she stepped back. "I'll tell the world. I'll hold a press conference tomorrow. I'll tell everyone you're my wife." Sarah looked at the gold ring he had brought with him, the one he was holding like a peace offering. She gave him a sad, small smile that hurt more than a scream. "The world already knows I exist, Ethan. I realized I didn't need your permission to be seen. I'm not a secret anymore, and I'm not a distraction. I'm just me." She looked back at the man by the spotlight, who was watching with concern, and then back at Ethan. The life she had built here was modest and quiet, but it was hers. Ethan stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her art, realizing that his power and his money were useless here. He had found her, but he was looking at a woman who had already moved past the version of himself he was desperately trying to save. Ethan returned to the gallery the next morning, but this time he wasn't alone. A sleek black town car sat idling at the curb, and he stepped out carrying a velvet box that contained a rare blue diamond necklace. He had spent the night convinced that his previous failure was simply a matter of scale. He thought he just hadn't shown her the extent of his regret in a way a billionaire should. He walked into the quiet space, the scent of fresh oil paint and salt air hitting him, and placed the box on the wooden table where she kept her brushes. He opened it, the gems catching the morning sun and casting dancing blue lights across the room. He spoke quickly, his voice filled with a desperate, practiced energy. He told her he had bought a new estate by the ocean, one with a massive studio designed just for her. He offered her a foundation in her name and a seat on his board. He offered her the world he had once hidden her from, now served on a silver platter. He apologized for the silence, for Victoria, and for the red carpets, promising that from now on she would be the only star in his sky. Sarah didn't even look at the diamonds. She looked at Ethan with a profound sense of pity that made him stop mid-sentence. She didn't see a powerful CEO. She saw a man who was still trying to use a checkbook to fix a broken heart. She gently pushed the velvet box back toward him, her touch light and final. She told him that the time for jewelry had passed years ago, back when a simple thank you or a shared walk in the park would have meant more than all the blue diamonds in the world. She explained that she didn't want a foundation or a studio built with his guilt. She wanted a life where she didn't have to ask for permission to be heard, and she had already found it. When Ethan asked if there was anything left he could do, Sarah gave him the hardest truth of all. She told him that the best thing he could do for her was to finally let her be as invisible to him as he had made her to the rest of the world. She walked him to the door, her expression peaceful and resolute. As the bell chimed behind him for the last time, Ethan realized that for the first time in his life, he had encountered something his money couldn't influence and his power couldn't bend. The drive back to the city was long and suffocating. When he reached the Vance Tower, his employees scrambled to open doors and hand him reports, their faces tight with a familiar fear. He walked into his office and the city stretched out before him, a glittering grid of light and steel that he owned. The Tokyo deal was finalized, his stock price was at an all-time high, and his name was on the lips of every major player in the industry. He was the most successful he had ever been. He went back to the mansion that night, the gates closing behind him with a heavy thud. He walked through the sterile halls, his footsteps echoing against the marble. He sat in his leather chair and looked at the empty spaces where Sarah's life used to be. The house was perfect. The silence was absolute. He had achieved everything he ever wanted. The empire, or the image, and the total lack of distractions. He picked up his glass of scotch and looked at his reflection in the dark glass. He was the king of a hollow mountain, surrounded by gold and glass, finally understanding the final lesson Sarah had left for him. Success without someone to share it with wasn't a victory. It was just a very expensive way to be alone.